Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. We have a special edition of this week's show where I talk to Haviv Rettig Gur, who will be the featured speaker at the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas annual event on June 2nd. Haviv Rettig Gur is a veteran Israeli journalist who serves as a senior analyst for the Times of Israel and is also a frequent guest on the Call Me Back and the Times of Israel podcasts. He has covered Israel's politics and foreign policy since 2005, reported from more than 20 countries, and served as the director of communications for the Jewish Agency for Israel, Israel's largest NGO. He's also taught at prestigious premilitary academies, and we will have links to Haviv's work and how to get tickets for the JCRC's event in the show notes. Haviv and I talk about what he's observing in the state of mind of Israelis, how politicians in the United States and Israel are getting plenty wrong about the war, and the misconceptions many have about the war and Israeli-Palestinian relations generally on this week's Who the Folk podcast, where I start by asking Haviv about the recently concluded run of Israeli high holidays, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaAtzmaut, what the observance of the latter two were like this year after October 7th, and what they say about Israeli society right now.
Well, thank you for having me, Lonnie. It's a pleasure to be here. We're doing this ahead of me visiting the community in Minnesota. I look forward to it. I want to just, it's such an interesting question because I find myself suddenly reflecting on the way that this year really was very different. And I think the first way that it was different for me, Memorial Day, Independence Day, was that it came home in a way that it hadn't in the past. My father was a combat veteran of the 73 war, and his battalion was very, very terribly hit in the first 24 hours of the war in the southern Golan. He was in the artillery, and so I had this story in my family history of my dad knowing people who died in a war, and Memorial Day was real. It was part of the ethos of the family and all of that. But this Memorial Day, specific soldiers who were family friends, who were at my wedding, were killed in Gaza. One of them was killed because he was volunteered to be in the front tank in a column that was on an operation to rescue hostages. And the Hamas cell in the battle, if I remember correctly, was taken out, but not before a missile strike at that first tank that killed him. And so I'm sitting there in Memorial Day for the first time in my life. I was a combat soldier myself, and we during the second Intifada, my battalion in the West Bank did some ambushes to catch terrorists coming into Jerusalem and things like that. And I've had wounded soldiers that I treated as a medic, but I've never actually known somebody close dying in war. And so this Memorial Day was about multiple people who I specifically know, either dying on October 7, being killed in the war that ensued, taken hostage. I know people who were taken hostage. So it was personal in a way that it had never been before. It's not even an ethos. It's not even a shared family story. It's me right now experiencing it. Mm-hmm. What was interesting was that we had a neighborhood ceremony in the street for Memorial Day, for Yom HaZikaron, and everyone felt that. In other words, I was sitting in the back exchanging jokes because, a ceremony is very serious, it's very somber, and with a neighbor friend of mine who had gone to the reserves and fought in Gaza for 4 months and then come out a little hurt. And so it was such a presence in our lives, and it felt very, very unifying. Independence Day is a day that follows immediately after Memorial Day, and you switch from the mourning instantly to the joy because the mourning is the cost. We say, ironically, from a poem by Nathan Alterman, The Silver Platter, on which the redemption, the joy, the self-reliance, the safety, the strength of this modern Jew, we are the strongest, safest Jews who've ever lived, even in this moment of crisis, is given to us. So we have to combine, this is the concept of the Israeli Memorial Day being the day before, like there's a minute that they flip to Independence Day. So there was that flip, but then Independence Day, we were still just kind of sitting there remembering, and so there was a joy there in the unity, in the realization or the remembering that we're all in it together, that everybody's going through this terrible thing together. There was the mourning and the terrible and the grief and the all at once. I experienced it as unifying, strengthening, but it was, it was all pain. So I don't know if that was coherent.
No, it is, but I think I think it's illustrative for an American audience to understand. Like, we know that it goes from one day to the next, but to hear it from somebody who's sort of living that, it's such an odd dichotomy right now, particularly right now, that it goes from very somber to very celebratory, literally when the clock turns. And this year, I would think it'd be a little bit harder to do the celebratory part.
It was harder. You know what I found? My kids had no trouble. My kids I have 4 kids, ages 4, 7, 10, and 13. So, the 13-year-old doesn't so much run in the street screaming because he's too cool for that. But my kids needed the celebratory. My kids have their dad has been gone most of the last 7 months. In my case, I've been speaking around the world rather than gone off to the war. But they have 2 uncles who went off to the war. As a family, we worked on helping and doing, getting the story out for family friends of my wife, who 8 members of her family were taken hostage on October 7th. And so the first 2 months after October 7th, my wife is basically helping her set up her sort of media war room to push the story of her family onto international press so that there's pressure to get them out. So mom and dad were gone in various ways, whether it's physically or emotionally. And the kids needed the celebration, and wow, did they celebrate. They ran around spraying each other with foam, and they put on flags that were, fluttering in every direction. My 7-year-old son managed to he took 3 flags. One was a cape, one was like a balaclava around his head, and one he put on a stick and waved around in the stick. So it was just this like a Tasmanian devil of Israeli flags flashing through the crowd. And that was part of them maybe reclaiming a little bit normalcy. So the celebration happened. Not so much the adults, but certainly the kids, and it was very healthy and very important. Things are getting back to normal, whatever normal is, but very slowly. So 2 of my wife's brothers were called up and spent quite a long time in the army at the beginning, and then have been out for a couple of months. And then one of them was called back recently. And so it's not going to be normal for a long time, but there is a kind of life that we are eking out, a normalcy that is coming back through it all.
So you mentioned that you've been traveling back and forth for the last 7 months between Israel and the United States. I'm curious, what kind of interactions are you having with your American audiences, and how are they responding to the messages that you're bringing of what's happening there on the ground? Because obviously your perspective as an Israeli journalist who has served in the IDF, who was there on October 7th, is going to be a little bit different from somebody who, like myself and like, many people here who just watched it happen, on social media and on TV.
I mean, there's a lot of interest. I mean, genuine fascination at all ages. I did a tour of college campuses, a lecture hall completely filled up, and filled up with my name on the door. In other words, I'm not a brand. It's, in the college age American student, right? But just the topic was absolutely fascinating to people. Anything that happens on Israel, people are in the Jewish community, where I've mostly been visiting and lecturing in the Jewish communities, also in Britain and Australia. I've also been traveling there over the last 7-8 months. There's been tremendous fascination and a lot of questions about Israel, and a real sense that American Jewry's imagination has gone there. You know, there's the old poem by Rabbi Judah Halevi from medieval Spain, where he says, my heart is in the east and I am in the uttermost west, by which he meant Spain. But
right.
You know, Minnesota is even further.
Yes.
But I felt that. Now, I don't know if there's a selection bias going on, right? American Jews who come to hear me might be the kinds of American Jews who are also thinking constantly about Israel. But I think that there's a really strong psychological focus on Israel. Something is happening in Israel that a lot of American Jews that I'm meeting think is part of their story of themselves and their future and what it means to be Jewish for them out in this other place called America. That's the first thing. The second thing I think that I've experienced was being really surprised at how anxious and worried American Jews are. Because I came from Israel for the first time, I think a month after October 7, I took my first serious trip overseas. And I met a lot of American Jews, I mean, many hundreds. And they were much more anxious than the Israelis I'd left behind. And that set me thinking quite a bit over the last 8 months. I think, by the way, with good reason, not because they're in danger, not at all because they're in danger. The discourse around anti-Semitism in America is serious, and college kids on campus have said to me, to my face, we can't go anywhere without these protesters following us. And it feels like a psychological pressure that targets us and not Israelis who can't hear the college protesters, right? So the local Jews are the ones who actually experience the focus on of those protesters. But I think it's American Jews starting to ask themselves about the future of America and America's character. Elite institutions not have gone, progressive or far left or I don't know what, supporting universal health care or things like that. But that in the elite institutions, an ideology has taken hold that goes beyond progressive causes to actually innate qualities of a person mattering, right? So Jews suddenly discover that they're the powerful and the powerful, powerless, oppressor, oppressed kind of dichotomy that this new ideology divides the world into, and discovering that therefore they don't get to grieve, and therefore they don't get to have hostages talked about, and therefore they don't get to, and Jews are more susceptible to it than other Americans because it talks about Jews constantly, right? It's about Jews, the conversation's about Israel, and it's also about Jews in America. All the people talking about Israel are talking about Jewish support for Israel in America as being part of the problem called Israel. But also, and identification as well, and Jewish identity also is a problem in this.
Absolutely. Yep.
But also Jews are just really left-wing. They're really liberal. I remember the numbers back when Obama was elected. Blacks voted 87% for Obama. Jews voted 84% for Obama. Way ahead of the third group, right? Of the third highest group.
Yeah.
By 15 points, I think, ahead of the third highest minority. So Jews are the places where Jews thought they were home. These elite institutions, the journalistic institutions, the academic institutions, the political home of many, many Jews, of most Jews in America, is the place that they suddenly discover turning on them. And so what's been most fascinating to me has been talking to progressive Jews going through some kind of awakening and living in some kind of fear. I'll stop there. I'm just listing the questions I've discovered rather than answers, but the questions have been fascinating.
And that's, right, and the questions are fascinating, and I think it's because it's still pretty raw. It's we're not that far removed, from October 7th, that I think people are still sort of I don't think anybody would expect you to have the answers to it. But I am curious though, is these college, the protests, the encampments that are popping up. We had them here at the University of Minnesota. We had them next door at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which is of interest to a lot of our audience here in the Twin Cities. A lot of Wisconsin kids, a lot of Minnesota kids going to Wisconsin. What do the folks in Israel that you talk to make of these sort of college encampments and what's happening there? Do they make anything of it?
Well, I'm glad you're asking me now, because if you'd asked me a week ago, I would have given the wrong answer.
Okay.
But we have had polls published on this specific question in the past week. Israelis take a very dim view of the actual protesters. I happen to believe that the protesters are a very big, eclectic, mixed bag, and there's a whole lot of really sweet, decent people. I would say a little bit ignorant about the conflict, but of course they're ignorant about the conflict. They grew up on the other side of the world and read what they read and didn't read more than that, right? But they're responding to a sense of urgency caused by seeing the suffering of a war. Now I can come and say, well, it's interesting that your media focuses tenfold or 100-fold on this war and not on much, much bloodier wars very close by and very recent. But that's a criticism of the media. It's not a criticism of the individual living through that information space and responding to it. And I think that most of these kids are that. But the core and the organizers have this ideology and this anti-Zionism. I guess, when someone said to an Israeli, okay, this is hard to see from overseas because most of the time when someone says the word Zionism overseas, they mean support for Israel, gratitude that Israel was founded. They mean things like that. But when an Israeli says Zionism, or put it another way, when someone says to an Israeli they're anti-Zionist, to an Israeli that's not entirely clear what that means. It's a very fuzzy thing. We don't. What do you mean you're anti-Zionist? We know something that the world doesn't know because the world didn't live our lived experience. But in our lived experience, the Zionist is the last living Jew. In other words, if you take out the English-speaking world, where Jews survived the 20th century, pretty much nowhere else did the Jews survive in any real numbers the 20th century. The 20th century is the story of the Jews learning English, learning Hebrew, or dying. So if I'm the Israeli Jew in the Eastern Hemisphere, I'm looking at Africa, I'm looking at Asia, I'm looking at Europe, I'm looking at 3,000-year-old communities wiped out in the last 70 years. And I'm hearing from you that you're an anti-Zionist, and I'm saying, but what is? They're all dead. Everyone else is dead. What do you mean you're an anti-Zionist? Just diagnostically, what are you saying? Like analytically, what was the word you just used? What does it actually mean? That we all should have died? That it's a shame some of us survived the 20th century in the Eastern Hemisphere? So it's a nonsensical term. So when we look at those college protests, a lot of Israelis, first of all, assume the worst, because we hear the worst also, right? Every time they scream Intifada revolution, which is quite a few times, so they deserve it. But still, we don't hear the decent, quiet people who just want the war to stop. We know that Intifada revolution means what we experience the Intifada to mean, which is massive suicide, waves of suicide bombers targeting our children. We know that, they know that, and everybody and sort of their allies pretend like that's not what they're saying. So we take a very dim view to the protesters. But then this week, I believe it was, I think it was out of Hebrew University. If there was a poll, I could find it or send it to people if they're interested to reach out to me. But there was a poll of Israelis in which they were asked not just about what they think of the college protest, but do they think it's representative? And there's good news. The Israelis don't think it's representative. They think Americans generally like them. They even think students generally want to be students, not want to be radical protesters. And they don't think that those college protests are representative of America. And I should say the actual polling in America suggests that they're correct.
It's been a fascinating time sort of watching this. And, at first we were sort of watching it from afar from Minnesota, and then it came to the quad at the University of Minnesota, and it was something that we spent a lot of time paying attention to because we had to. Not the most favorite thing I've covered, but it's what's asked of us as journalists. We got to cover those stories that we don't want to sometimes.
Yeah, it's also, we should say, human suffering is good for the business model. With journalists, we do very well when wars break out or pandemics break out. We should do a little bit of it's a little bit of guilt in that, I think, in journalism, where when people are suffering, we're suddenly relevant. But it's important. It's important. What we do is important, and when we have to write those unpleasant stories, they're the most important ones to actually write.
No, absolutely. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, because in the midst of everything else in Israel, we're sort of looking at pretty deep divisions within Israeli society right now. There were 40-odd weeks of protests of Prime Minister Netanyahu's judicial reform plan, if that's what we want to call it. Then there was a sense of the nation coming together after the horrors of October 7th, and now it's feels pretty unclear, at least watching from afar, where things stand right now. with everything going on in Rafah, the demand for the return of hostages, it feels like the divisions that we had a year ago, or even 8.5 months ago, are back. What's your sense of where things are right now?
I think the divisions are back.
Okay.
I blame the politicians. I blame
Seems
Benjamin
like it sounds a reasonable place to start.
Yeah, I blame Benjamin Netanyahu because he's the prime minister, but I don't at all think that it's only him. Across quite a wide swathe of Israeli politics, the politicking itself is back, and for many, many politicians has overtaken any question of the war. Most Israeli members of Knesset don't actually have a role to play in the war because the decision-making of the war cabinet is fairly self-contained. There is a committee, the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Knesset, that's supposed to have some oversight and debates and questioning the government strategy and being that sort of, that wall to that the government can check ideas against, and there's quite a few very talented and very experienced and very serious people in that Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. But otherwise, the Knesset really doesn't have much of a say in the war. A lot of the politics quieted down, the ultra-Orthodox politics, Netanyahu's political campaign, the Twitter feeds that we are fairly sure are Likud campaign Twitter feeds run out of Likud operations overseas, basically, quieted down. The Yesh Atid party dropped almost all politicking. Benny Gantz of the National Unity Party joined the coalition to stabilize the government, to give Netanyahu breathing room so he wasn't quite as beholden to the far right of his coalition, just in terms of parliamentary numbers. So there was a lot of sort of people either trying to tamp down their politics because they think that voters will punish them if they look like they're politicking after October 7th, or actually doing things that really buck their political interest and were for the national good. And 4 months or so went by like that. And then about 4 months ago, it all came swinging back. And some of it necessarily. I mean, we are now having a very big and I think quite polarized debate over the ultra-Orthodox draft. One of the reasons we're having that debate is that the army needs more soldiers and there's nowhere to get them. And the ultra-Orthodox, who were once 3% of the population, are now 13% of the population. And so it's just a question of demographics that we're going to need to be able to field the kind of army we need to field if we're going to have a 7-front war for the next 10 years with Iran, right? So a lot of the political debates are back, and the predatory kind of politics that you see everywhere in the developed world. There's massive polarization increasing in not just in America, not just in France, where it's really intense and people really see it, but Canada. Canada is falling apart into these deeply polarized camps. It's a function of social media algorithms. It's a function of high mobility, which creates these kinds of big sorts where people more and more live next to like-minded people. Fewer and fewer of your neighbors with every passing decade in the West vote differently from you. More and more districts have landslide vote elections over the course of the decades. So we're seeing that phenomenon. And in Israel, it kicked back into high gear over the last 2-3 months. I would also say, and again, very much Netanyahu is leading that phenomenon, that return of those things back into public life. And I would also say that one of the things, just to connect it with the first question, one of the things that I think were joyful about the painful moments of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut was that was gone again. And it was because we were forced to sit and think, in a consistent way about the fallen soldiers, about the victims, about the sacrifices it takes to win independence and safety in this world. We forgot the politics for 48 hours.
Yeah. I mean, the distraction is nice, I suppose, to not have to think about those things. But also, something I found really interesting, I visited Israel in February, and there was sort of the posters of the missing, the hostages were all over, they're all over the airport, they're all over the ride in from the airport, and there's sort of this specter hanging over things. Like Tel Aviv was vibrant, people were out, they were driving, they were on the Tayelet, but it was that the specter of the missing was just sort of hanging over so much of everything. Is that still feel the case?
Increasingly. There's an ironic, because we thought there would be a way to get them out through the war effort itself. The war effort would pressure Hamas and to buy time, to buy release, to be able to rescue trapped battalions. Hamas would release hostages. And so we'd get them out with this very intensive war effort. And then I think over the last 4 months, the war effort really quite ground to a kind of slow creep. And that, because of American pressure, I think because of bad Israeli decision making, but that has led to a lot of frustration among the public, because back in October, the defense minister explained to us how he's going to get hostages out. He's going to squeeze Hamas so hard, he's going to push them so hard against the wall that the only way they buy time to breathe is with hostages, and that's how he's going to get out hostages. Now, that worked spectacularly well in the November exchange. To basically rescue the northern battalions, Hamas gave 140 hostages. But then the war effort didn't continue at that pace and intensity. And so the hostages were never... Hamas has shown us that the best way to get hostages out is intense war. And so there's a lot of frustration. The center left in this case, I say that with air quotes, has been most critical in protesting this government on the question of hostages, because they don't think the government wants the hostages out, in part because they don't think the government is fighting hard enough. In other words, if you're either fight the war, we've seen a huge increase in the number of Israelis from about 20%, give or take a few points, to about 60%, give or take a few points, who say this government isn't going to win the war. And the reason they say that is that Israelis are becoming convinced by the slow motion of the war, by the fact that we're 8 months in and still only at the gates of Rafah, that the government isn't trying to push that forward. Now, I don't know if the government's trying or not trying. I don't want to comment on the substance of the complaint, because the substance of the complaint, I think, is secondary to the fact that people believe it. If you believe we're not going to win, or this government can't win, then you naturally also favor signing whatever ceasefire you need to sign to get as many hostages out as you can, cut your losses and get the hostages out, right?
So I want to take a look at the American side of things a little bit. You've mentioned some elements in this question, so, forgive me, but you've had some interesting Twitter interactions about President Joe Biden's decision to pause some weapon shipments to Israel over disagreements about the whatever operation might be happening or not happening in Rafah. You've alluded to a catch-22 of Israeli-American relations, the gratefulness that Biden has stood with Israel so strongly, but also being critical of the move to pause the weapon shipments. And then there's the, as you mentioned, Netanyahu's poor handling of the war and the humanitarian crisis. Curious if you would elaborate on some more of those dynamics, and or do you see Israel's crisis of leadership feeding into Biden's decision makings that leaves a lot of Jews and Israelis frustrated?
I certainly think it's part of it. The perception, never mind the reality, because again, the reality is disputable. It's complex. There's a lot of data points leading in all different directions. The perception of an incompetent government in Israel drives look, if you don't think this government can win the war, you don't want the war. You only want the war if it can be won. So the perception that you can or cannot win is fundamental to our allies, to Israeli public. One of the reasons that I blame our prime minister for a lot of that is that he frankly doesn't speak. He does not frame the war to Israelis. He doesn't explain why we didn't move for 3 months. He doesn't explain why at one point we're going into Rafah. What Israelis see is that when Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir from the far-right parties threatened to leave the coalition, then Netanyahu goes into Rafah. In other words, they see a deeply politicized war instead of being told by Israeli leaders. Netanyahu fashions himself a kind of Churchill, because Churchill stuck to his guns, etc. But Churchill's central contribution to the war effort in World War II was to tell the story of the war in real time. It looks bad now, but victory is available to us. There are paths to victory. And you know what? If we don't have victory, this is still the right path to walk, right? If the British Empire and its Commonwealth last 1,000 years, let them all say this was their finest hour, right? Framing the political, moral, strategic war. And we have leaders who refuse to do that, and there's a tremendous loss of morale in the public, and we're measuring it everywhere. I mean, right-wing pollsters and left-wing pollsters are all measuring the same thing. So I think if it's having that effect within Israeli society, it's driving Israelis to protest. I can't imagine it's not a part of the story of the Biden administration's skepticism of Israel. Some of the Biden administration, by the way, policy toward Israel, as you said, I am someone who, every time I criticize Biden, and I have criticized him a lot because I think some of the things the Biden administration has done has been really foolish. Also, I'm a foreigner to whom he owes nothing. And he has given me tremendous gifts, decisive gifts. The aircraft carrier battle groups that came in to make sure that Israel could think carefully and slowly and not worry about October 7th also being a secret Hezbollah operation we didn't expect on the northern border. In other words, that sort of hard, fast, immediate shrinking of the problem that Biden ordered right at the beginning was a tremendous thing. The visit by an American president in, what was it, a week or two after, right? It was right at the beginning. Astonishing. And the American government, Congress just passed and Biden signed into law $14.3 billion in aid to Israel's war effort, including $1 billion to Iron Beam, which could be a game changer in the future. So I don't get to come to you, Lonnie, okay, you're an American citizen. He works for you, okay? So if you don't like the color of his shoes, you can slap him around as much as you want. He's your president. That's great. I believe that. But he's not mine, and I don't get to not be grateful because he doesn't owe me any of this. So that's A. That's the bottom line. That's the baseline. B, a lot of what America has done in this war has been foolish and extended the war unnecessarily. And if you want Israel and Hamas to negotiate hostages, and you are skeptical of Netanyahu's intentions, and so you squeeze the Israeli government very publicly, don't be surprised when Hamas walks away from the table. Because when your opponent in a negotiation is sweating, that is not a moment where you leap in with whatever the offer was 10 minutes ago, so that they don't accidentally get too generous on you, right? If Biden squeezes Israel, Hamas will wait it out because it wants to see the effect of the squeeze. So I think again, the gratitude isn't there, and it's real, and I don't have a right not to be grateful. Also, the hostages might have been out already, if not for this constant, slow-moving skepticism, pressure from the Americans. Even that, by the way, ultimately goes back to my leaders, goes back to Gantz and Gallant and Netanyahu, because just because Biden's telling you not to do something doesn't mean you don't do it, if it's massively within our national interest. So I have a very complicated view of the situation. I mean, I don't think Biden has been bad for us, because he's been so good for us. Some of the policies have been foolish in ways that I blame the Americans, but, when foreign allies are foolish, that doesn't mean my government has a right, my government should resist it and do what it needs to do anyway. I don't even know if that's a right-wing or a left-wing critique, because it kind of comes from both sides.
No, and I think that's fine, and I think it speaks to a lot of the angst that, it's not ideological. It's, it's a pretty, you're allowed to borrow from both sides of the, both ideologies to get your point across.
I wish he'd prosecuted the war faster. Yeah. Like Smotrich says, right? I agree with Smotrich talking about Rafah. And I agree with Gantz talking about how our government should have had a much, much closer relationship with the Americans and talked less. A lot of our politicians have talked in very silly ways in this war that have hurt the war.
That's probably true. And I think one of the really hard things about trying to negotiate anything with Hamas is we've seen that, with Gilad Shalit back in 2006 through 2011, I think was when he was finally released, they'll negotiate several thousand for one, and they'll wait it out. So this is, I think that becomes the hard thing about how long do you wait? How do you play the game? I'm not sure Hamas can be rushed is sort of the point there.
Yeah. We taught Hamas. Well, it can be rushed, obviously. It can be facing such dire straits that the only way it survives is giving us the hostages. But that's at great cost to all the Palestinian civilians around the Hamas installations and all of, and Israeli soldiers, etc. I would, I tend to agree with you, but one of the things we discovered really on October 7th was that we had taught Hamas that hostages are our Achilles heel. So Hamas doubled down on that Achilles heel 245-fold.
Yeah.
And now we have to teach Hamas that our hostages, when it takes our hostages, that's the Palestinian Achilles heel. And it's frustrating to me that our government has, in my view, failed to do that most of the time, but not failed. In the November exchange was exactly the right policy on the Israeli side. And Hamas's northern battalions were in dire straits, and it rescued them. And we haven't put them in that situation enough to rescue the rest, and we should.
I think it's hard to... I am no military expert. I am no veteran. I'm just a guy who writes and talks, right?
Ronnie, we're journalists. We know everything about everything. The important thing is the confident tone.
Okay, so then I will start spinning that a little bit differently now that I have your permission. Thank you.
Good.
But I think this becomes I'm not going to call it a problem, but it's the situation where Israel is doing everything it can, despite what some on campuses might say, to protect Palestinian civilians that Hamas doesn't much care for. So I don't know how you prosecute a war and try to bring your hostages home when that's the enemy you're fighting. And I'm certain that's probably something similar that many Israelis think also.
Right. I mean, the simple truth is that Hamas's fundamental war strategy, it's almost horrifyingly impossible to say, but its fundamental war strategy is the mass death of Palestinians. Mass death of Palestinians is how Hamas intends to survive this thing. That's its main force multiplier against Israel. And that's what those tunnels are. And those tunnels are the single biggest thing ever built by Palestinians. 17 years Hamas has ruled Gaza. It basically built nothing else. And Gaza's economy was bent to build. It's 1.5 times the London Tube. I think it was something like 13 years of active construction to build those tunnels. More than that, because the Shalit kidnapping in 2006 was a tunnel. So
yeah, it was a tunnel. So
tunnels
18 years
being
ago
dug
for
by
at least
Hamas
18 years.
For 18 years in Gaza. Since at least a year before Hamas actually took over Gaza, it was already digging tunnels in Gaza. So that whole thing is this astonishing engineering achievement. And its entire purpose is to force us to cut through the civilian population to get to the Hamas military protected underground. And so our goal has to be, and the way we neutralize their main strategy is by preventing civilian deaths. The army learned that very fast and became really good at it. And if you just look at the delta, you look at a chart of the change in death toll over time, it's this very steep decline in the first 6 weeks. And then we've held it quite low since then. So, the numbers rose quickly very early and then stopped rising quickly and then have risen very, very slowly since then. The Israeli army, just in the last week in Jabalia, went deeper into a tunnel than it had ever gone, engaged in a pitched gun battle deep inside a tunnel, and killed the battalion commander of the Khan Yunis battalion. And that's something that tactically the Israeli army of 6 months ago didn't know how to do. And so the Israeli army has improved its fighting methods. A major element of improving its fighting methods has been improving its ability to not hurt collateral civilians in Gaza. By the way, that doesn't mean Gazan civilians aren't suffering. They are suffering. They are displaced. But nevertheless, they're not dying. They're not dying at the rates of the beginning. And that's an Israeli decision. So yeah, it's a weird, and also important to just give context. It's not unique to Hamas. This idea that your side's civilian population is the vast human shield and its mass death is actually the political undermining of your enemy. That was the National Liberation Front of Algeria's view of Algerian civilians in the war with the French. And the French actually killed 500,000 Algerian Muslims in that 8-year war. So it's we saw it in Vietnam. It's a classic insurgency, reality of insurgency warfare. And it's true of Hamas. Hamas's leader, Yahya Sinwar, is sitting underneath Gaza, or not Gaza, but Rafah, or maybe Khan Yunis. And he is deeply frustrated at this very moment that there aren't 250,000 Palestinian dead. Because if there were, he'd be winning.
Yes.
So it's a horrific truth of Hamas and a huge problem.
So what do you think the number one thing American Jews, and maybe Americans at large, based on what you've seen, who you're talking to, what you're reading, are misunderstanding about Israel and the war in Gaza right now?
The number one thing they're misunderstanding. That's such an interesting question. I don't think that Westerners generally really actually believe that we have rich, serious, deep stories. There is a liberal gaze that looks out at the world and sees very shallow people, very sort of flattened cartoons of human beings out there in the world. And it talks about them in these very abstract terms because they don't have rich, deep stories. So, people who aren't even slightly curious about why Hamas is willing to fight with a strategy of mass Palestinian deaths, pre-planned strategy of mass. Why that's a Hamas strategy. And it has a lot to do with a deep and old religious vision of Islamic restoration that sees the entire redemption of the world as beginning in the removal of Israel. And so 10,000 dead Palestinians, 100,000 dead Palestinians, as Hamas puts it, they're a nation of martyrs. They're the silver platter on which the redemption of the world is being handed to the world. You're welcome, right? Now there is a deep, deep discourse that's at least 150 years old in Sunni Arab Islam about Islamic weakness and how you return Islam to strength and glory. And you do it by bringing Islam back into God's grace, which is lost with the impiety of modernity and blah, blah, blah. The point is, it's rich, it's deep, it's serious, and it's old. And in the West, people look at Hamas and say, oh, they're either, sympathetic view is they're responding to occupation. What would it take for me to mass murder children? Westerners are asking. Well, I must be really traumatized to the point where I'm clinically insane. So the Israelis must have traumatized the Hamas to the point where they're clinically insane, and that produced Hamas. So the Israelis are at fault for Hamas. It's a great assumption if the only world you can imagine is your literal self everywhere else in the world. In other words, the liberal gaze assumes that everyone in the world is us, but with funny accents. And I think that that's the major problem. And it doesn't mean you don't reach conclusions that are negative. You can look at the Israelis and say, hey, you're doing 10,000 things wrong, and you're doing some really important things wrong. But you have to be able to answer the question of why. Why do the Israelis are real people, three-dimensional, thoughtful, deep, interesting, vivid, Ditto Palestinians, real people, thoughtful, deep, interesting, and vivid. And if you don't know their story, the story that they approach their situation with or from, you're just going to project yourself onto the story and your moral cartoons onto the real humans living through this place, living in this place and living through this war. I think the main thing that the West gets wrong is that it looks everywhere the West looks, it tends to just see itself. And that's, to me, very shallow and very frustrating because it's an ignorance that doesn't recognize ignorance. It's ignorance, right? And so it's a problem, especially when it drives policy.
No question. So you're going to be joining us here in Minnesota for the JCRC annual event on June 2nd. What do you plan to tell the Twin Cities Jewish community at the event? Like, obviously not your whole talk right now. We've covered a lot of ground here. But what's the main thing you're hoping to get across to this audience?
I think the main story for Jews of the last 8 months isn't the story of our divides, and it isn't the story of our trauma, and it isn't the story of progressive Jews suddenly discovering that some of their closest allies actually think of them as oppressors, and all of these really sort of difficult moments that people are going through in various different parts of Jewish politics and Jewish culture and the Jewish world. I think the most fundamental story, when I get confused, and I'm usually confused, most things confuse me, and when I get confused, I fall back on fundamental things. Here's a fundamental thing. There has never in the history of Jewish communities anywhere on earth been a community as integrated, safe, accepted, loved, and also politically influential as American Jews. Ever. And no generation of American Jews that has been stronger than this generation. And so if American Jews are facing a crisis, a problem, a painful moment, by the way, they're facing it. We're seeing it. It's in the polls. If Jewish college kids in America go from 15% levels of participation in Jewish life on campus 8 months ago to 40% 5 months ago, those kids are desperately looking for Jewish life because they're looking to cling to other Jews because something is happening that's being experienced by them as a challenge to their identity. And that something is happening on campus, that something is not happening in Gaza. Those kids are looking for Jewish life. They're not the Jewish, encampment protesters. So something big is happening. My message is you are strong enough to meet it. There has never been a Jew as strong as you. Ditto the Israelis. We are the strongest, safest Jews who've ever lived. And it's not just that we're strong. The generations that came before us bled and sacrificed for our strength, built our strength. If we now collapse into anxiety and recrimination and fear, we desecrate their sacrifices so that we can be strong in this moment of challenge. We are the strongest Jews who ever lived, and it's our job to get up and act like it.
Couldn't think of a better place to wrap on. Haviv Rettig Gur, thank you so much for joining me this week. Safe travels on your journey through America, and we look forward to seeing you here in the Twin Cities on June 2nd for the JCRC annual event.
I look forward to it. It's going to be really exciting. Everyone should come, and thank you so much for having me.
The Who the Folk podcast is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network and a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.